Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we're going to talk about the missing manna. What do we do, or what's one of the common reasons why the provision from God seems to dry up? If you've been there, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And I would suspect that most of us, if we walk with the Lord for any period of time, we have entered into a season where all of a sudden it's like, wait a minute, where's the provision? Like, this is how I've communicated with him. This is how he's provided. This is the way my relationship with God has looked. And then all of a sudden, something changes. So there can be many reasons for that, but I want to talk about one of the more common ones that we don't necessarily think of in this way. So, how often do we get used to God providing in a certain way, right? I remember a number of years ago, I was sitting with one of my kids. They had lost their job and it was unjust. It was painful. It was not nice. It was nasty. And so I'm sitting with them and I listen to the story and let them get it all out. And then I slowly began to talk about the faithfulness of God and the goodness of God, and that they were at a crucial crossroads because in this moment there had to be a decision made with how they were going to handle this situation. When they were asked about the job, how were they going to respond? Were they going to respond from a place of cursing or from even a place of uncovering? Or were they going to respond from a place of blessing? And with that, as we talked about everything, we talked about the biblical principles behind each response. Now, I use that as a lead in to where we're going when God's provision dries up, because sometimes when that provision dries up, it's in the form of a paycheck. Okay. And we're left there going, good grief. Now, now what do I do? But right now, you want to say, but God. Just say, but God, but God. Okay, so let's dive into the word. Let's take a look at this scriptural principle here. So let me give you the backside of the story. You all know the story about the Israelites and they're wandering through the wilderness and and taking this very long roundabout way to get to the promised land. And so through that, of course, there was a lot of murmuring and groaning and complaining going on, and sounds like a lot of us, doesn't it? But anyways, in the course of all this, one of their complaints was they didn't have anything to eat. So God begins to rain down manna. And of course, manna means, what is it? They didn't even recognize it, but it was his provision for the season. But they had that for years. And so what happens when God provides in a certain way for years? We get used to it, right? But God knows best. And so in Joshua 5:12, we find the manna stopped the day after they ate from the produce of the land, and the children of Israel no longer had manna. That year they ate what the land of Canaan yielded. Okay, the manna, the provision of manna, was for a certain aspect or leg of the journey, if you will. Even though they crossed over into the promised land, there was still work to do. Even though they crossed over into the promised land, there was still ground to be taken. But they had to go from a cycle of like this food falling down from heaven being provided into actually learning the whole principle of sowing and reaping. Now with sowing and reaping, we usually talk about that like in actions and decisions we make. Here we're talking about they had to learn to work with what the Lord was giving them and to actually like till the land and manage the herds and the flocks and and that cycle of sowing and getting back and basically working for their provision. So God provides the space, the time, but they still had to work for it. It was a new season. And so the thing is, again, the manna stopped the day after they ate from the produce of the land. Okay, so they no longer had the manna from them. Okay, so here's some keys. Number one, when provision dries up, you are most likely on the threshold of a new season. And that can be so incredibly exciting and so incredibly scary all at the same time, right? Okay. But when the provision dries up, when the way that God's been speaking to you, the way that he's been dealing with you, the way he's been providing for you, when it dries up, chances are you're stepping into a new season. Number two, so therefore, when the provision dries up, we need to ask God what our next steps are, because it will require movement, which goes to number 3. When provision dries up, it's time for movement. Okay, so because if we're stepping into a new season, that word step, we're stepping into a new season. There's something that has to happen. There's forward movement that has to take place, because this takes us to number 4. We can't receive the provision for the new season if we're still looking for provision from the old season. Okay, we cannot receive the provision for the new season if we're still hanging on to the past, if we're still looking for provision as it was in the past. This is a huge, huge sticking point for many believers. While God's always done it this way, he's always spoken to me this way, he's always provided this way. But God is a God who wants us to walk into the fullness of our destiny. So therefore, he may take away the provision so that we walk, so that we're almost forced into a new season. We actually see examples of this through scripture. Okay, think of Elijah. Even though he ran in fear and he lay down under the tree, eventually the brook dried up. His provision began to dry up, and he had to move to get to the next spot. So, okay, so those 4 keys again. Number 1, when provision dries up, you're on the threshold of stepping into a new season. Number 2, when provision dries up, we need to ask God what our next steps are. Number 3, when provision dries up, it's time for movement. Number 4, we cannot receive the provision for the new season if we're still looking for the provision in the old season. Remember, the manna stopped the very day they ate from the produce of the land. You see, when God's doing a new thing in our lives, it always, 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 always requires change and transition of some form. It always will. So the Israelites went from the easy provision, as I mentioned, to learn the cycle of sowing and reaping as they ate from the land, as they learned to what the land produces and how to use that. And this would have felt uncomfortable. Remember, this was a generation that had been born in the wilderness. They had never had to till the land. They were busy eating the manna, roaming around as children in the dust through the desert. They hadn't learned to till the land. This was all new. This was all new to them, and we forget about that. So it would have been uncomfortable. There would have been a learning curve involved. There would have been some insecurity involved as they looked ahead and stood on the promises of God and reminded themselves of the promises of God and learned to do a new thing, because God was providing in a different manner. If God had kept providing the manna, where would their faith have been? You see, sometimes when God provides a certain way, our faith becomes in that thing, that manner, rather than in the God who provides. Very common with a paycheck. Okay, so that's one of the things when I left my full-time position to do what I'm doing now, I had to weigh out, did I trust God enough to make up the income that I've been getting in that check? And it's real easy to say, oh, well, I don't depend on that, God will provide, until that's pulled away. So as I was mentioning with one of my kids, here they are, just suddenly, boom, without that income coming in. Is the faith in the manna, or is it in the God who supplies in each and every season? So with that, when the manna dries up, there needs to be a new way of thinking for the new season. In other words, the provision that we knew may not be the provision for the next season. So there has to be a new way of thinking that goes with that. Manna was the old season. The fullness of the promise of the land was the new season. So with one of my kids, what we did is we talked about blessing, and they made a decision to align with that spiritual principle. And the blessing, the spiritual principle is that the blessing outweighs the curse. And they decided to align with that and just stand and believe that God would provide, even though, interestingly enough, they were not really walking with the Lord at that point in time. And yet they put this into practice, because I'll tell you something, even when somebody's not walking hand in hand with the Lord in their life, there is blessing when you apply a spiritual principle. Okay, how much more for those who are walking with the Lord? Okay, but God honors, there's spiritual principles that he just honors. So they put this into practice, and what happens? Well, COVID hits. Okay, and so there's a lot of people not working, and the job market begins to tank, and all this stuff is going on. But God, they adhered, they stayed fast to that spiritual principle. And so later, in the middle of COVID, in the middle of a horrendous job market, they were offered a job that they didn't apply for. They had applied for something else within that organization and offered more money than what they were asking for, and benefits that started on their first day of employment, and massive vacation time, and this, that, and the other thing. And this position, this new position in the new season, has been a blessing in ways that they never even imagined, because they were able to let go of the manna from the past season, follow God's principles through the transition, which opened up the door for the new land that they were to occupy. So again, the only way they could get there was to let go of the past season, align with God, do things his way, align, in that case, align with the spiritual principles, so that they could move into the new season. You see, sowing and reaping, God does provide, but he likes the partnership, which is the sowing and reaping. Biblical principle, Galatians 6, 8, and 9. For the one who sows to his own flesh will from the flesh reap corruption, but the one who sows to the Spirit, from the Spirit will reap eternal life. Let us not grow weary in doing good, for in due season we shall reap, if we do not give up. Therefore, as we have opportunity, let us do good to all people, especially to those who are of the household of faith. You see, new seasons have tons of possibilities, but we have to let go of the old. We can't get so caught up in the missing manna that we miss what God's doing, how he's positioning us for the new season. Today, if you are missing the manna, reach out to God and refocus. Go back and say, okay, God, that manna's gone. That means I'm on the threshold of a new season. So what are my next steps? How do I move? Where do I move? And I'm going to let go of that old season. And I'm looking to you and trusting that you will provide for the new one, because that's who you are. All right. Have a great day. Be so blessed. Once again, go to that event page and check out what's going on, so that we have something that you can come to and join us for. You will be able to join us. So the website is ruthhendrickson.com. Please share this. Okay. I think this was a really pivotal message. Please share that. There's so many who are looking at that missing manna, and they're trying to find it again when the Lord's saying it's time to move on. And so really share this and put your comments. What are your thoughts as you've been listening? Where are your struggles at? Because as we share, we help each other out, we grow together. And so really want to encourage you to do that. And again, visit the website, ruthhendrickson.com. Whatever you do, keep looking up, not for the manna, but to the provider. Keep looking up to the Lord, the one who is worthy of it all, the one who's worthy of all praise, the one who knows exactly what you need for this season and what you need to get to the new season. So be so blessed and have a great day. And remember, you're here for such a time as this.